The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night, bouncing off buildings as unmarked vehicles swarmed the quiet street. Within seconds, the area was sealed off. Agents moving with precision, their radios crackling with codes and commands. And at the center of it all was a name that shocked the world. Jim Jones, the rapper, entrepreneur, and Harlem icon, had been taken into custody in what sources described as a carefully planned FBI sting operation. The arrest wasn't the part that rattled people the most. It was what came next. Federal agents claimed to have tapes, secret recordings allegedly capturing deals, conversations and exchanges that painted a darker picture of Jones' world than anyone expected. The rumors spread like wildfire. What kind of deals? Who else was involved, and how long had the FBI been watching him? In the hip-hop community, the news hit like a thunderclap. Fans, collaborators, and even critics couldn't believe it. Jim Jones, who had built a career on hustle, survival, and resilience, now found himself in the harsh spotlight of federal scrutiny. Social media exploded with disbelief. Hashtags filled timelines, and whispers of conspiracy collided with speculation about what the tapes might reveal. The scene outside the FBI office that night was chaos. Reporters shouted questions, flashing cameras illuminated the air, and supporters shouted his name. But Jim said nothing. Surrounded by agents, his expression was unreadable, a mask hiding whatever storm brewed beneath. What was on those tapes? And why had the FBI chosen this moment to strike? The story had only just begun, and the fallout would shake not just Jim Jones' career, but the entire culture that had celebrated him for decades. The night Jim Jones was taken into custody, Harlem felt like it had stopped breathing. Streets that usually buzzed with music, cars, and the voices of neighbors suddenly carried only the faint echo of sirens. People leaned out of windows, peering into the dark, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. By the time the word spread that Jim Jones had been arrested in an FBI sting, the news had already started its sprint across phones, radios, and television screens. Inside the FBI's holding facility, Jim sat quietly, his wrists in cold steel cuffs. For years, he had carried the image of a survivor, someone who had navigated the dangerous balance between the streets and the stage. He had fought battles, both in music and in life, and somehow always found a way to come out stronger. But this was different. This was the federal government, and they weren't playing games. Agents moved methodically, cataloging evidence, recording statements, and briefing each other on next steps. On the surface, it looked like a standard arrest, but whispers among insiders painted a darker story. The FBI had been watching Jim for months, maybe even years, carefully piecing together fragments of conversations, transactions, and patterns until they had enough to make their move. The tapes were the centerpiece. Rumor had it that Jim's voice had been captured, his words tying him to deals no one expected him to be connected to. The nature of those deals was still shrouded in secrecy, but the prosecutors hinted at something big, ties that extended far beyond music, far beyond Harlem, into networks that the FBI had long been chasing. It wasn't just about Jim Jones anymore. His arrest was a thread in a much larger investigation. When news of the tapes broke, the internet erupted. Fans defended him passionately, insisting that the FBI was targeting him unfairly, that the system had always been against successful black men from the hood. "This is another setup," one fan tweeted. "They can't stand to see Jim winning." Others weren't so sure. They dug into his history, revisiting old controversies, analyzing lyrics, and stitching together theories that made him look guilty before any trial had even begun. Meanwhile, Jim's family and closest friends gathered in disbelief. His mother, a pillar in his life, sat in silence, shaking her head. She had seen him rise from the streets of Harlem to stages around the world, building a legacy for himself and his crew. To her, this was more than an arrest. It was an attack on everything he had worked for. His closest allies huddled together, trading whispers. their loyalty unshaken but their fear undeniable. Back in the courtroom where Jim was first brought to face a judge, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled every available seat, pens and cameras ready, their attention locked on him. Jim walked in with his head high, his demeanor calm but his eyes sharp, scanning the room as if searching for answers that weren't there. He wore the same confidence that had carried him through decades in hip-hop. But beneath it, there was tension, the kind of tension that comes from knowing the stakes are higher than ever. The prosecutor wasted no time. He spoke of the investigation, of the evidence collected, of tapes that allegedly caught Jim making secret arrangements. He painted a picture of a man double-living, celebrated artist by day, shadowy negotiator by night. Each word hung heavy in the air. And though Jim's defense team immediately objected to the dramatization, the effect on the public was already sealed. The narrative of Jim Jones as more than just a rapper was locked into place. Outside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Crowds chanted, some in support, some in anger. Cameras flashed as fans held up signs that read "Free Jim Jones," while critics shouted that justice was finally being served. Every moment was recorded, every second broadcast, every image dissected online. In the age of instant media, the trial had already begun, not in a courtroom, but in the feeds of millions around the world. Jim, however, remained silent. He didn't flinch at the prosecutor's words, didn't react to the judge's stern tone, didn't let the weight of the cameras break his composure. He knew better than anyone how perception could shape reality. He had built his career on controlling narratives, on turning struggle into power. Now, that same skill would be tested in ways he had never imagined. Late that night, as he sat in a holding cell, Jim replayed the events in his mind. The flashing lights, the cold metal of the cuffs, the stares of agents who believed they had finally caught him. He thought about the tapes, about what they might reveal, about who might have betrayed him. Was it someone close, someone he trusted? Or had the FBI been 2 steps ahead the whole time? These questions circled endlessly, gnawing at him, refusing to let him rest on Harlem. The reaction was raw. Some refused to believe it, calling it another example of the government tearing down successful men from their community. Others whispered that they weren't surprised that success always comes with secrets, that the higher someone climbs, the more dangerous the fall becomes. Conversations lit up barbershops, street corners, and living rooms. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had the full truth. The industry, too, reacted swiftly. Collaborators stayed quiet, carefully crafting statements of support without tying themselves too tightly to the storm. Labels calculated risks, wondering what this would mean for future projects. Rivals seized the moment, throwing subtle jabs on social media, while allies promised loyalty. The uncertainty created ripples, shaking the very foundation of relationships Jim had built over decades. For the FBI, however, this was only the beginning. Jim's arrest was a headline, but the investigation promised to uncover more. Agents hinted at connections, at webs of influence and money that stretched wider than anyone realized. Jim Jones wasn't just a target. He was a key piece in a much bigger puzzle. And as the world waited for more details, one thing became clear: this was more than just a scandal. It was a battle for survival, for reputation, and for legacy. The morning after Jim's arrest, New York City felt different. Headlines screamed from every newsstand, each paper splashing his name across bold black ink. Jim Jones arrested. Television anchors spoke with the same hushed tone they reserved for major scandals, while social media turned into a courtroom of its own, each user playing judge, jury, and executioner. The hashtag Free Jim Jones trended almost instantly, but so did hashtag Tape Stan's single quotes to lie. The world was divided and the lines were clear. Inside his Harlem neighborhood, the tension was even heavier. Old friends debated fiercely, some claiming the FBI had fabricated evidence, others insisting Jim had gotten caught up in something he couldn't control. In barbershops, the talk wasn't about music anymore. It was about betrayal, loyalty, and the thin line between hustling and crime. Some argued that Jim had always been about the streets, that his authenticity was part of what made him beloved. But others whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had gone too far. And the government had finally caught up. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, the FBI began to carefully release fragments of information. Leaked reports suggested that the tapes in their possession didn't just capture vague conversations. They allegedly held Jim's voice discussing financial exchanges, coded language, and names that had yet to be revealed. Prosecutors hinted that these recordings tied him to networks bigger than anyone had imagined, stretching beyond Harlem into other cities and possibly even overseas. Every leak added fuel to the fire, and every revelation drew more cameras, more reporters, more noise. For Jim, the pressure was relentless. Each time he appeared in court, the crowd grew larger. Paparazzi shouted questions about the tapes, about his crew, about whether he planned to cooperate with investigators. Jim said nothing. His silence became a weapon, but also a canvas for speculation. Was he staying quiet because he was innocent, or because he knew too much? The public wanted answers, and every day without them made the mystery grow. Behind the scenes, Jim's legal team worked around the clock. They argued that the FBI had overreached, that the tapes were taken out of context, that Jim's words didn't amount to criminal activity. But privately, even his lawyers couldn't deny the seriousness of the charges. The federal government didn't move without confidence. They didn't stage stings without building a case piece by piece. The question wasn't whether they had evidence, it was how much they had and how damaging it could be once revealed in full. Back in Harlem, Jim's family tried to keep a brave face. His mother, heartbroken, defended him fiercely in interviews, insisting that her son was innocent, that he was being targeted because of his success. His closest friends refused to turn their backs, showing up to court in solidarity. Their presence a silent reminder that Jim wasn't alone. But even in their loyalty, cracks began to show. Whispers spread that someone close to him might have been the one to help the FBI, feeding them information to save themselves. Betrayal hung heavy in the air, poisoning every conversation. The hip-hop community responded with mixed emotions. Some of Jim's peers posted supportive messages, using their platforms to rally behind him. Others stayed quiet, unwilling to attach themselves to the storm. A few even mocked the situation, dropping subliminal lines in songs and interviews, suggesting that Jim's downfall was long overdue. The industry, like the streets, was split down the middle. Some saw him as a victim of a system that always hunted men like him. Others saw him as a cautionary tale, proof that you couldn't outrun your past forever. Meanwhile, the FBI continued to tighten the screws. Behind closed doors, they pushed for cooperation, hoping Jim might flip and give them names. If there was one thing Jim Jones was known for, it was loyalty. Loyalty to his people, loyalty to the code he had lived by. To flip would mean betraying everything he had ever stood for. And for a man who had built his career on authenticity, that was a line he wasn't willing to cross. At least, not yet. The rumors about the tapes grew louder. Some claimed they revealed conversations about drug shipments. Others said they tied Jim to financial schemes that funneled money in ways no one had expected. The truth remained hidden, locked in the hands of federal agents. But the uncertainty was enough to send shockwaves through every circle Jim touched. If those tapes ever became public, they wouldn't just take down Jim Jones. They could unravel entire networks of people. And then came the night that shook Harlem again. A local news station claimed to have obtained a snippet of the recordings. The audio was muffled, grainy, but a voice that sounded unmistakably like Jim's could be heard, talking in coded terms about moving weight and keeping the streets quiet. Whether real or fabricated, the clip spread like wildfire, online igniting a frenzy. For Jim's supporters, it was a smear campaign, a dirty trick by the FBI to control the narrative. For his critics, it was confirmation of everything they had suspected. Jim, watching from behind the walls of his cell, remained unshaken. He had survived storms before, and he believed he could survive this, too. Why? But even he couldn't ignore the growing sense that this time, the storm was bigger than him. This wasn't just about his music, his crew, or his reputation. This was about survival, about whether he could hold on to his freedom in the face of the most powerful system in the country. As the trial date loomed closer, the energy only intensified. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Fans wore Free Jim Jones shirts. Politicians even weighed in, some using his case as an example of systemic injustice, others pointing to it as proof that no one was above the law. Harlem stood at 8, a crossroads, waiting to see whether one of its most famous sons would rise again or fall permanently. And somewhere, in the shadows, those who had stood beside Jim wondered whether the truth on those tapes would drag them down too. The FBI hadn't revealed all their cards yet, and until they did, no one knew just how deep this rabbit hole went. The day of Jim's official arraignment arrived, and Harlem was holding its breath. The courthouse was swarmed before sunrise, with cameras, vans, and reporters staking their claim on every inch of pavement. Supporters gathered with signs, chanting his name, while critics shouted back with equal passion. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a cultural earthquake, with every move magnified under the world's microscope. Jim stepped out, flanked by federal agents, wearing the same calm mask he had shown since the first night of his arrest. His hair was neatly braided, his eyes locked forward. And though the weight of the moment was enough to crush most men, he refused to look broken. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every angle, every step, every second of what had become the trial of the year. Inside, the tension was suffocating. The prosecution wasted no time outlining their case, speaking of tapes, secret meetings, and coded conversations. They painted Jim as more than a musician. They described him as a central figure in a sprawling operation, someone who had walked the tightrope between legitimacy and illegality for too long. The words landed heavily, sinking into the minds of everyone present. Jim's defense team pushed back hard. They argued that the recordings were ambiguous, that the government had twisted vague conversations into evidence. They reminded the jury that hip-hop culture often used coded language, that lyrics and slang weren't criminal confessions. They painted Jim not as a mastermind, but as a target, a successful black man from Harlem who had become a symbol, unfairly caught in the government's crosshairs. The clash of narratives electrified the room. Every word from the prosecution felt like a nail in the coffin, but every counter from the defense sparked hope in his supporters. The judge, stern and unflinching, listened intently, careful to keep order as tempers flared. Outside, the public fed on every scrap of information, twisting and turning it into arguments that tore through timelines and comment sections. But the real tension came from the unknown. Everyone wanted to know what was truly on those tapes, reporters speculated, endlessly, quoting anonymous sources, analyzing leaked snippets. Some claimed there were hours of recordings that implicated Jim in deals that reached far beyond New York. Others said the tapes proved nothing concrete, just the FBI's attempt to spin coded street talk into criminal enterprise. The truth remained, locked away, guarded like treasure, and until it was played in open court, all anyone had were rumors. In the weeks that followed, Jim's life became a cycle of hearings, late-night strategy meetings with his lawyers, and restless hours inside his cell. He thought often about loyalty, about the faces around him, about who might have put him in this position. The idea that someone close could have flipped haunted him. Every conversation replayed in his head, every handshake, every whispered word. Who had been real and who had been feeding the feds? Meanwhile, Harlem tried to carry on, but the absence was felt everywhere. The man who had once stood as a symbol of hustle, pride, and resilience was now a ghostly figure, seen only through court appearances and grainy photos. Murals popped up overnight, painted by supporters who refused to let his legacy be defined by headlines. At the same time, critics doubled down, arguing that his fall was inevitable. You couldn't live in two worlds forever. The music industry reacted with calculated caution. Streams of his catalog surged as fans revisited his work, but future collaborations and deals were quietly put on hold. Record execs spoke in hushed tones about the risks of association. Younger artists, however, loudly proclaimed their loyalty, using their platforms to demand his freedom. The debate wasn't just about Jim anymore, it was about what he represented. And then, in a dramatic twist, prosecutors announced they would soon begin releasing parts of the recordings in open court. The announcement sent shockwaves across the city. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the chance to finally hear what the FBI claimed to have. News outlets cleared space in their broadcasts. Fans prepared to stream every second. And Harlem braced itself for impact. When the first tape played, the courtroom fell silent. The crackle of the audio filled the air, followed by a voice that sounded unmistakably like Jim's. He spoke carefully, using phrases that seemed coded, discussing movements and numbers in ways that prosecutors argued could only mean one thing. The defense objected immediately, calling the interpretation biased. But the sound of Jim's voice lingered in the room like smoke. Outside, the response was explosive. Clips leaked instantly, shared millions of times within hours. To some, it was damning proof. To others, it was a reach, an example of how the government twisted culture into crime. Debates raged late into the night, splitting families, friendships, and communities. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone believed they were right. For Jim, the reality was sinking in. His fight ahead would be brutal. His freedom, his reputation, his legacy, all of it hung in the balance. Yet even in the darkest hours, he refused to show weakness. To those around him, his resilience was inspiring, a reminder of why so many loved him. But privately, he carried the fear like a shadow, one that grew longer with each passing day. The case was far from over, but the path forward was clear. The tapes would continue to surface, the trial would drag on, and the world would watch every second. Harlem would continue to stand divided, the music industry would whisper, and the FBI would press their advantage. Jim Jones, the hustler, the rapper, the survivor, was now trapped in the fight of his life. Whether he would rise from it stronger or fall permanently into the system's grip remained the question on everyone's lips. And until the final gavel dropped, the story would only grow bigger, louder, and more dangerous. Because this wasn't just a trial, it was a battle for legacy. And the outcome would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom.